I put this talk together primarily with past or hopeful practitioners in mind. So this was my thinking. You're thinking about making the art, and that's your job, right? But my remarks are intended to make you aware of what may happen once your pieces are out there. So if you have some of these things on your back burner, my hope is that you will be able to avoid some of the minefields that are out there. And all of you need to be congratulated for either doing this or wanting to do it, because it's not easy. But it's really, really worthwhile. I just want to start with some basics. I'll get to that in a minute. When you're applying for a commission, and what to be mindful of if you get it. We were also going to consider some controversial works and what went wrong. And this is, again, this is a kind of caveat, because once it's out there, there's no telling, right? It's like sending your kid to school. You're done. They're on their own. Not quite the same. And I want to also discuss how use and reciting can change the perception and even the meaning of a work of art. And finally, on a more positive note, we'll look at works that really, really made a difference in many different ways, and that's a kind of plea not to give up on the practice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be using very familiar examples, because I'm talking about what happens to these works, not what they are like in terms of aesthetic decisions, although we can talk about that later. So why this is up there is because I'm often asked how I became involved with public art in the first place, and it's all that sculpture's fault. I was a student at the Institute of Fine Arts. I was getting my PhD in Italian Renaissance art, which clearly this is not. I was also working at the same time near Wall Street as a computer programmer and an analyst. And, you know, so in a way, don't be discouraged if you've already made several career choices. I obviously did, and it turned out okay, although it felt a little scary at the time. I'm sure you know, those of you who have that experience, I'm sure you know what that means. So I couldn't understand what this was doing here, right? I'm studying Italian Renaissance art. It's called Noguchi's Red Cube. It's really a rhombohedron, but who knows what that is. So I asked Gordon Bunshaft, who was the architect at Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, and who was responsible for the commission. That's an architecture firm that always commissioned a lot of art. And he said to me, it's for the client, just like he buys good furniture. Now, he didn't say stupid, but his tone implied it. And that really made me think about what was going on out there in a very, very different way. I can't say that I have an answer to all the questions that it prompted, but I have been fortunate enough to serve on quite a few commissions and selection panels, which have given me, as Bunshaft did, a real-world perspective, not a theoretical one, although that comes with the academic turf. And also, of course, I was lucky to teach on several different levels, and I always learned tons of things from my students. So some of the basic steps if you want a public art commission, for those of you who haven't had one. How many people here are thinking about doing it, but you just haven't done it yet? Just not too many, so I'll be quick about this because probably the rest of you know. Make sure your images are in key databases, because panelists do look at them. Research the call for proposals very carefully. Who put it out? What are their goals? Who are the principal stakeholders here? Are there any obvious conflicts among the stakeholders? And that can get really, really serious. For example, if you think of Columbus, well, Italian Americans and indigenous people are stakeholders, but they have very different perspectives. So if you're walking into that minefield, you need to be aware, right? Is there a relevant local history or contemporary issues that might impact any interpretation of your work? And I'll give you an example later where that does in fact happen. It's critical to visit the site. Critical, critical, critical. Sometimes it's not possible, I understand that. But the site defines, or at the very least frames the content. And you can't really get the sense of it, I think, unless you're there. It's important to know how people use it. Is it a place to meet up, to sit, to have lunch? What's going on there? Is there anything missing there? For example, no seating, no lighting. Maybe they want you to take care of that, but they're not saying it. You know, that could be an issue. Are there any problematic parameters? Are there tall trees, overpowering buildings? And that said, keep in mind that sites are rarely, if ever, static, right? New trees, new buildings, changing demographics, different concerns. Once you get the commission, this is all very obvious if you've done it before, but again, I was thinking there might be people who hadn't. Read the contract carefully. Have a lawyer look at it. Don't sign anything without having a lawyer look at it. Make sure there's a maintenance budget. If you can, do periodic examinations of the work yourself, or have somebody you know go and make sure that it hasn't been defaced or deteriorating in some way. Find out if there are local school programs that include public art, and if so, go tell them about your piece. Offer to speak to their students, maybe even take them there. It's a really good way to drum up interest. And consider the inclusion of a kill fee, just in case. It does happen. Can I have the next one, please? I'm going to start with a number of controversial works and what went wrong. So the conventional wisdom is, and I believe it to be true for the most part, he who frames an issue usually wins. Okay, he who frames the issue usually wins. I'll give you an example in a few moments. This, of course, is Serra's Tilted Arc. Is there anybody in the audience who doesn't know what this is? Good. Yeah, really? Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say it's probably still the most famous public art controversy. You'll catch what it is in a second. I was kind of overwhelmed when the whole controversy, which was incredibly passionate, was going on, and I made a visit to the dentist, and all he wanted to do was know what I thought about this. I'm like, wait, this has really gotten out of control here, right? So it's commissioned in 1979 by the General Services Administration. It was installed 2 years later in 1981. At that point in time, the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, named the selection panel. That was the practice at the time. The selection panel consisted of the director of the Neuberger Museum in SUNY Purchase, the director of the Lowe Museum, the University of Miami, and a New York art critic and historian. And this was always interesting to me, and I never got an answer to this. So I always, if I have ongoing questions, I always ask whoever I'm talking to. The first choice of this committee was Robert Irwin. How do you go from Robert Irwin to Richard Serra? How is that even possible that you could? Anyway, I don't know the answer, and I know some of the people on the committee, but I have not been able to find out. Irwin was eliminated because he had a previous GSA commission, and you were only supposed to get one. I can't imagine what Robert Irwin would have, and it was an interior space. I can't imagine what Robert Irwin would have done in Federal Plaza, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, so one of the problems with this was that the Javits building and the plaza had already existed for 10 years. There was no warning that this was coming. There was no public participation in the process. It's a much better situation if your art goes up at the same time as the building, right? You don't want your art to be a surprise, because are often not good, right? In life and in art. Another word about the plaza itself, the fountain didn't work. The plaza had already been cited as one of the worst public spaces in New York City, and the conditions inside the building weren't great. Nevertheless, the sculpture was criticized from the start, but the initial flurry had subsided by 1984. That was the time when William Diamond was appointed the GSA regional administrator of the New York office. And he immediately launched a campaign to have Tilted Arc removed. And as I said, this was so intense that I was like having a hard time wrapping my mind around it. Why are people so crazed about this? I went to speak to the director of the GSA in Washington at the time, who told me that Diamond had, and I'm quoting, made it his mission from God to take the sculpture out. So you had somebody in charge who was going to do this no matter what. That was in New York. And you had somebody in Washington who, as he told me, was going to study it to death. Nothing was going to happen on his watch. So not exactly art issues, right? So what did the sculpture do? What were some of the problems here? It did divide the plaza. It was 120 feet long. But the real problem, I think, was it blocked the sight. It was 10 feet high, and you couldn't see over it. It didn't really block your path. I was down there many times, and you could easily, from each of the two buildings that frame the site, walk across the plaza, because it was the pool that determined where you could walk, right? But it felt like it was a sculpture because you couldn't see over the top. That said, Serra's intention was also problematic. He said, I found a way to dislocate or alter the decorative function of the plaza and actively bring people into the sculpture's context. After the piece is created, the space will be understood primarily as a function of the sculpture. It's really the obligation of the sculptor not to be defined by the power structure that asks you to please make this space more beautiful. So Serra saw the plaza as somehow representing the American political system, and he didn't want his piece to become its symbol. And he had an attitude at that point in time that art had to be oppositional, public art, to maintain its integrity. And this really raises a very interesting issue that I think we don't talk about enough, which is the distinction between art in public places and public art. Initially, when the NEA was the selection panel, it was all, their program that sponsored this was called Art in Public Places. And to my mind, art in public places is like in a sculpture garden. That's art in public places. Public art, you've got all kinds of other parameters that you really need to consider, some of which I just mentioned before. And don't forget, the media thrives on controversy. And the media seems to live in New York. That's at least what we think. And I wonder, would there have been so much of a brouhaha if Tilted Arc were located somewhere else? I have my doubts. So it's a kind of either-or frame that really tends to, what should I say, fan the flame. So Tilted Arc was blamed both for not improving Federal Plaza and for rendering it useless. Both those things can't be true, but it does reveal that there's an underlying expectation that public art should somehow function as urban renewal. You know, what I was saying a little bit before, is there lighting, is there seating, whatever. Serra argued his case under the First and Fifth Amendment. The First Amendment is free speech, Fifth Amendment is due process. The GSA argued that their removal was not based on content. So that implies that abstract art has no content. And you're really in much more danger with these First Amendment issues if the work is abstract. The courts didn't agree that abstract art constituted free speech, so that didn't fly. And they also ignored that the site with public art is in fact part of the content. They also thought that the hearing that Diamond staged in 1985 was due process enough. This was a hearing where many people testified, most in favor of keeping it, but it was very much, what should we say, choreographed. In the end, it was a property issue. The GSA owned it, and Serra's rights were not protected in the contract. That's why it's so important to read the contract. Serra was promised permanency by the head of the Art in Architecture program at the time, but that did not hold water. Eventually, it was removed at night in 1989, and there were no guidelines then, nor do I think there are now for deaccessioning, and that's another thing you would want to look at when you look at the contract or any commission that you might undertake, are there principles for deaccessioning, and what are they? Property rights. The GSA owned it. That was the end. It's still in storage in a warehouse in DC, I believe. You can make an appointment to see it, and people have done that. One art historian who was writing about controversial works made the observation that Tilted Art was probably more famous than it ever would have been had there not been a controversy. I'm certain that's true. Let's have the next one. This is a controversy with a happier ending. This, of course, is, as you can see what it is. This was initially an uncommissioned work, and I'm not championing that you should put your works out there without a commission. It's a dangerous business, and it really doesn't always work. This is a work from 1986. It was then on an abandoned concrete handball wall on 128th Street and 2nd Avenue, and you can see it's near the Harlem River Drive there. Now, this is where I'm talking about larger issues being at play. This was the time of Reagan's war on drugs, but it also coincided with Mayor Koch's crackdown on graffiti. And so this was in New York, and the city initially arrested Haring and fined him $100. That the mural was vandalized and transformed into a pro-crack mural that read "Crack is it," and the Parks Department had painted over. But there was such a groundswell and media support for the original work that the city backpedaled and asked Haring to recreate it as a permanent work. They offered him 8 different sites. They offered him paint. They offered him the use of a van. You can't make this stuff up. The artist chose the original site, and then he put the other mural on both sides. That was the only difference. In 2007, the Haring estate financed the first restoration of the work. In 2012, it required repainting using a more durable paint system. Maintenance, do not forget maintenance when you put something out there. Make sure it's covered by something, and if your estate can handle it, fine. Okay, what else can go wrong? Next. The public might not understand what you're saying at all. That's what happened to David Hammons, How Do You Like Me Now, in 1988 in DC. It was created for the Washington Project for the Arts, the WPA, part of WPA exhibition, The Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture and Modernisms. It was a 14 by 14 tin billboard installed in a downtown DC parking lot. This is across from the National Portrait Gallery, and of course depicted Jesse Jackson as a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. The kids who were watching this saw it as racist because Jackson, of course, was black. Some 10 of them smashed it with sledgehammers before it was even totally put up. Warning, be mindful of literal readings. Sometimes that's the only way people who don't have an art background can understand what they're seeing. It's not a bad idea to do a looks-like survey with non-art people before you finalize your design, because they may see things that you're not thinking of. Subsequently, the work was reinstalled in the WPA gallery alongside a row of sledgehammers, which is a way of incorporating its history, and it's, I believe, always displayed this way now. Can I have the next? This work makes an obvious point, I think, and an important point, but it turned out to be way more controversial than anticipated. This was commissioned by the Public Art Fund for a billboard, obviously based on the famous Anga painting of the Grand Odalisque in the Louvre, and the figures wearing the gorilla mask worn by members of the feminist collective. So this work was a reaction to the 1984 International Survey of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA. Only 10% of the 169 artists included were women. Then part of what the Guerrilla Girls did, they did what I love this, they called it a weenie count at the Met. They compared the number of nude males to nude females on display. There were fewer than 5% of works in the Met's modern art galleries were by women, but 80% of the nudes were women. That's quite a disparity. Public Art Fund rejected this, allegedly for lack of clarity. I keep wanting to say to you, I'm not making this up, because I couldn't. So the Guerrilla Girls smartly rented advertising space on New York City buses until the MTA canceled their lease because, I'm quoting, the image was too suggestive and the figure appeared to have more than a fan in her hand. You think? The Guerrilla Girls reissued the poster in 2005 and 2012. Of course, you can anticipate that there could be, problems with works with suggestive content, but you can't always, nobody could have anticipated that. Lack of clarity? I mean, come on. Can I have the next, please? This is another work with suggestive content. This is Paul McCarthy's Tree, done in 2014 for the Place Vendôme in Paris. It was part of Paris's International Fair of Contemporary Art, FIAC, you probably know it as Outside the Walls program, 79 feet high. It's really quite high. Green plastic inflatable sculpture supposed to be a Christmas tree, but it clearly resembles a butt plug. And the artist was attacked while he was installing it. It was up for just 2 days. The vandals cut the power supply, keeping it inflated, and they also cut the cords that were holding it up. McCarthy didn't want it repaired or replaced. The artist meant it as a joke. Please beware of jokes in public art. They may not end well. And I love this. This is just a detail. It led to an increase in the sale of actual butt plugs. Seriously, one Paris shop, in the month that the work went up, their sales went from 50 to 1,000. That's a good question. I didn't see that. Meanwhile, FIAC got complaints that it was corrupting, I'm not kidding, the sacred symbol of the Christmas tree. Okay, location. A different site, a different audience, as you can see on the right. That's it in 2016. It's displayed at Paramount Ranch 3 in the Santa Monica Mountains. This was the final year of a fair that featured art from less established galleries. And the work was displayed, and you can probably get a sense of it from this, near the entrance where it was the first thing visitors saw. There, the reception was really positive. The visitors, the press said, reveled in its absurdist glory. So, location. Okay. Also, on a more serious note, although these issues are serious, evolving values also change interpretations. Can I have the next one, please? Of course, Mount Rushmore, for years an iconic national memorial comparable to the Statue of Liberty, seen as a symbol of U.S. democracy, but not by Native Americans. The original idea for this sculpture came from the South Dakota state historian Doane Robinson. He wanted to increase tourism to the Black Hills where Mount Rushmore is located. If there ever was a beware of what you wish for, that was it. His idea was very different from what you're seeing here. His idea was to depict local heroes, including Native American chiefs. But the artist's idea, it's Gutzon Borglum, he wanted to celebrate, quote, the foundation, preservation, and continental expansion of the United States. Nothing about essential democratic values. Expansion here is the key word. More recently, the serious concern that has surfaced is that the monument was built on land once inhabited by the Lakota Sioux and ceded to them by an official treaty with the United States. Just as a reminder, Native Americans have a very different concept of land. It's not considered private property. You can't own it. It's communal, and it's more like a mother that nurtures you. And of course, our Western notion is that it's something you buy and sell, and it's the basis of a lot of wealth. By 1970s, Mount Rushmore had become a site of Native American activism, and the problem now is how to acknowledge this history properly. There needs to be more information in public programs and there is now than there used to be, but there still needs to be more Native American perspective. So again, if you're walking into a situation that has political ramifications, it's something to think about, how you might create a work that adequately conveys that conflict. Meanings typically change over time with use. Can I have next? This, of course, is one of our best-known memorials in D.C. It commemorates Lincoln as the savior of the Union, however, not the great emancipator. Slavery was still too problematic an issue and could not be mentioned in this work. However, through use, can I have the next? The meaning gradually changed. Marian Anderson performed a concert there on Easter Sunday in 1939. She was banned from the planned concert hall by the DAR, by the Daughters of the American Revolution. At the time, we're talking 1939, the nation's capital was still segregated. Anderson had to sleep in a private house. She couldn't stay in a hotel. So this was primarily a symbolic triumph, but it was very important nevertheless. In 1963, when Martin Luther King staged his March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, he used the Lincoln Memorial specifically to legitimate political issue. He began his speech with a direct reference to Lincoln 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Couldn't make a clearer link, right? And of course, Barack Obama in 2009, commemorating his election as the first Black president. And by now, its meaning has totally evolved. A far less dramatic change, the next, going back to where we started just for a moment. I think this was, you can't see it so well here, but I think this was actually initially an aesthetically successful piece. Just try imagining the space without it, right? It just sort of dissipates out. It took on a very different context during the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in 2011, because it's located across the street from Zuccotti Park, which was this protest, of course, Occupy Wall Street against economic inequality, and that was in the wake of the financial crisis resulting in the recession. The protest was initially planned to take place around Charging Bull, but the police were ahead of the protesters. They had already put barricades around that sculpture. So in some strange way, this then became associated with Occupy Wall Street. Have the next, speaking of Charging Bull, which went up in 1989. This was a guerrilla installation also, like the Haring mural. The artist was an Italian immigrant. He started the sculpture after the 1987 stock market crash. He wanted to inspire people to carry on through hard times and celebrate the perseverance of the American business professional. And so the idea of a bull like a rising market after the crash resonated. He spent $360,000 of his own money, and he put it in front of the New York Stock Exchange on December 15th in 1989, middle of the holiday season. He thought of it as a gift. The city did not. They officially removed it that same day, but again, there was a public outcry that it be returned, and then it was put in the location at Bowling Green about 2 weeks later. The meaning of this work changed next with the installation of Kristen Visbal's Fearless Girl, which was installed in 2017, one day before International Women's Day. Now, this is a totally corporate undertaking. It was brought in by State Street Global Advisors, SSGA. The project was created by McCann, New York, which is an advertising agency. It was led by their senior art director and their senior copywriter, and it's meant to stand firm in the face of Charging Bull. It was intended as a statement for women in the workplace. The plaque says, "Know the power of women in leadership. She, capital S-H-E, makes a difference." But she, capital S-H-E, is SSGA's NASDAQ ticker symbol. So we're dealing not exactly with a pure artwork, shall we say, if there is such a thing. The permit was extended because there was a positive public response again. In 2018, it was moved to a site facing the New York Stock Exchange. They'd left a plaque here that says, "Fearless girl is on the move to the NYSE. Until she's there, stand for her." And they left footprints so people could take pictures. I haven't been down there since then, but I imagine they do. Modica, the artist of the bull, claimed that the girl was, quote, attacking the bull and it was an insult to his work. There is a, yeah, it's really, as I said, you can't make it up. But in all seriousness, there is a problem, I believe, in adding works to existing sculptures, even if you're wanting to make the content clearer. If you add something to an existing work of art, you're changing the meaning of an original work of art created by an artist. Would you do that to a book? Oh, gee, I don't like this interpretation. Maybe we should think about it this way? I don't think so. Again, we're going back to what kind of content does art have, and this is very figurative. It's not the abstract issue with Serra, but there's a lot of talk when we're talking about now bringing problematic memorials up to date, making them more in line with contemporary values, of adding works of art to create a dialogue. I think it's problematic for the reason I just said. Okay, so literally changing a site, the dimensions of a site may also change its perception. Can I have the next? Tony Rosenthal's sculpture dates back to 1967. It was part of the Sculpture and Environment exhibition organized by the New York City Department of Parks, served as a gathering place. The major attraction was spinning it. It took a couple of people. In 2022, the spinning mechanism stopped working, had to be repaired, and also the whole exterior site was changed. So the sidewalks were expanded. I think you can see that pretty clearly in the image on your right? A pedestrian plaza area was added, the traffic was redefined, and so the sculpture was no longer the focal point of the traffic circle, and to my mind, its impact has been much reduced. I'm not sure how often people spin it. I haven't been down there that much, but if anybody knows, I'd be curious.
They moved it across the street.
And it's closer to Coop, yeah, and it just doesn't hold the space in the same way. So now we're talking about what I would say is a change to aesthetic perception, right? But, a lot more people shopping, and I don't know, before it was the thing, it was a focal point. If you were on that traffic circle, you were on there for that sculpture. Now, as you say, people are just wandering around, and maybe they're paying attention, and maybe they're not. Have the next one, a more radical site change. Again, history can catch up with your works of public art. Originally at the World Trade Center, designed by the architect Yamasaki, it was commissioned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The architect also designed the ring of fountains that were originally around it. He thought that they might resemble the Great Mosque of Mecca. I don't know that anybody actually saw it that way. He also intended it to symbolize world peace through trade and commerce, and he wanted it to convey humankind's responsibility for the fate of the modern world. You can have a whole lot of ideas in your mind about what you're doing, but make sure they're somehow communicated to your audience who is not in your head with you. This, of course, was damaged during the attacks of 9/11, 2001, but it was mostly intact. So for a while it was dismantled and stored at JFK. In 2002, it was rededicated with an eternal frame, temporarily in Battery Park, and it became a kind of interim memorial to the victims and survivors of 9/11, a symbol of resilience and strength. So sort of a de facto memorial, nothing like what the artist ever intended, but obviously an effective history. In 2017, it was moved to Liberty Park, overlooking the 9/11 memorial. The 9/11 Museum Concourse still has a model on display if anybody's interested in, looking at it somehow more closely. Okay, those are problems. Let's talk briefly about works that make a difference, aesthetically, politically, and in every way. Let's have the next. I think that Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate from 2004-2006 in Chicago's Millennial Park makes a huge difference aesthetically and for the users of that space. It's been nicknamed the Bean, which is understandable. Don't forget that looks like comparison can come to haunt you, right? The central arch is 12 feet high. The artist wanted to play with the light and mix the various varying reflections of Chicago, and he's done that, and it's had a huge aesthetic impact. It interacts with its environment. It mirrors the urban life around it. Viewers make a point to walk under it, look around, take pictures. I've never seen it without all that going on. Okay, works that make a political difference. Can I have the next? And I could have selected others, but I was just going for some works that were really well known. This was commissioned in 1979 on Christopher Street, intended to honor the participants, of course, of the 1969 Stonewall riots. The sign in the park now says, "The sculpture by George Segal and his dates, his birth-death dates, honors the gay rights movement and commemorates the events of the Stonewall Inn opposite this park that gave rise to the movement." It was commissioned by Peter Putnam, who was a trustee of the Mildred Andrews Fund. He had also commissioned the Kent State Memorial that I imagine some of you or most of you are familiar with. Initially, they first asked Louise Nevelson, and her gallery advised against it because of the subject matter. They didn't want her identified as gay. It's interesting to speculate what she would have created, but it would not have been anything that looked like this, that's for sure. The commission stated, I'm quoting, "It had to be loving and caring and show the affection that is the hallmark of gay people, and it had to have equal representation of men and women," end quote. There's generally not in the literature enough emphasis on what commissions stipulate. Usually when people are writing about a work of art, they assume it's all up to the artist, especially with memorials, but they are very clear stipulations in most commissions, and you need to pay attention to them if you want to get them, obviously, and I think it needs to be just something that we think about more in conjunction with the finished work. Many objections to this piece, mainly due to homophobia. Later, it was objected to by trans artists and activists. They wanted to see more strident figures. They wanted more people of color. It does, in a certain way, normalize the presence of gay people in a non-confrontational setting. However, and this was interesting to me, it may have made it too normalized, because over the years when we were looking at this in various classes I was teaching, many of my students didn't initially see the figures as gay. And if you look at it without knowing what you're looking at, I can see that could be an issue. In 1984, there was a second cast installed at Stanford University facing the science and engineering quad. Still a time of widespread prejudice against gay and lesbian people. Sculpture was attacked, had to be restored then and again in 1994. But each act of vandalism prompted calls for political engagement. Eventually, there was a university-wide ban on LGBT discrimination. So it's important to keep in mind that even when we have these attacks, sometimes the message gets hurt. The meaning involved also through historical developments. In 1992, AIDS was an additional factor. In 2015, it seemed to address the legalization of gay marriage. In 2016, after the Orlando nightclub shooting became a shrine, people left flowers and candles and signs. And in 2016, Obama designated the Stonewall Inn and Christopher Park as a national monument. Can I have the next? Sometimes the dialogue about these works is expanded through exhibitions, and I just wanted to show this one briefly. This was at the New Museum in 2018. It was called Consciousness-Razing, R-A-Z-I-N-G. The Stonewall Memorialization Project was done by Chris Vargas and MOTA, the Museum of Transgender History and Art. And it invited 12 artists to propose new, what were called liberation monuments. So I think what we're looking at all the way over on the right is Catherine Lord's plexiglass Trajan's column stuffed with t-shirts with lesbian slogans, and Nikki Green's pile of Stonewall branded bricks, and visitors were invited to take one and use it as they saw fit. I don't know whatever happened with that, but I thought it was interestingly provocative. And the next one, this changed the model of and the conversation around memorials to this day. Just a reminder, Maya Lin was a senior architecture student at Yale. When she designed this, it was an assignment for a funerary architecture class, and my students always loved that she only got a B-, and her professor entered too. It's true. It was commissioned by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund with the stipulation that it be reflective and contemplative in character, that it harmonized with its surroundings, especially the neighboring national memorials, that it contained the names of all who died or remained missing, and that it make no political statement about the war. So again, I just want to establish the parameters that she was working with that were not coming from her artistic invention alone. Another thing that's been very interesting, I think, is the way, has everybody been there? Or you've seen it enough, right? So one of, I think, the most effective things about it is this experiential nature, right? That you're walking into this, suddenly it's over your head, Lincoln Memorial's behind you, and you're walking out towards the Washington. That was not her idea. She originally had seen it that you would be walking across the lawn, kind of where the three soldiers, servicemen are standing, which we'll look at in a minute. So you would be approaching it head on. This was the Park Service because they had drainage issues. And they needed to make sure that those were addressed, but I think it made the memorial, so ever much more effective. So again, sometimes these things can work out for the better. The initial objections were legion. There was the subject, the color, the order of the names. They're listed in when they were killed, when they died, and they meet in the middle. Yeah. And they come together. Right, and they come together at those high walls in the center. And again, that, that's not immediately obvious when you're looking at it. You can find names, there are books where you can look them up. But again, it's an interesting way to think of listing the names because it incorporates the history of what happened to the people. And there's a real problem with listing things alphabetically, you can imagine, right? You're going to have all the, common names are all going to be clumped together. This is not a clear solution, but I think it's an interesting solution. Up the next. I just found this a very interesting development. They're half-size replicas that tour the country for those who can't go to DC. That's how important this memorial has become. I actually saw it when it was installed behind the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. And people make rubbings and they leave things at the base. They act just as if they do, as they do in DC. It doesn't have the same effect, of course. Kirk Savage called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial the nation's first therapeutic memorial, because it was intended to heal a nation. I think it's really an important observation that makes us think about what is it we want our memorials to do. And if you go now, today, to the National Park Service site, it says the memorial includes the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, the 3 servicemen statue, and the Vietnam Women's Memorial. Can I have the next? This is the 3 servicemen, of course. In 2004, there was a plaque added in memory of the men and the women who served in the Vietnam War and later died as a result of their service. We honor and remember their sacrifice. So that was after the fact, realizing that people were dying not there, but in their civilian life. I had a very interesting experience. One of the times I was visiting there, I happened to be standing next to the memorial, and I was with a little boy, I would guess he was about 8 years old, with his mom, and he's tugging on his mom's hand, and he's pointing to Maya Lin's sculpture, saying, look, there's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I think that that's the way it generally is perceived. Can you have the next? This is a distance away. I don't think anybody really perceives it as part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. One of the things that I think they still do, I know they were doing it for a while, when teachers bring students, they take the boys to the 3 servicemen and the girls, I can't. I hope that's changed. There are over 10,000 women who served in Vietnam. After this, they put a stop to it because people were worried that we would be getting, memorials to guide dogs and what have you. It was enough. Let's go back to Maya Lin, the next one, please. A reminder that this competition was anonymous. The panel was made up of professionals only. I'm not suggesting that that be the only model, but I do think that professionals have a kind of distance that the immediate family members and others who are directly affected by this can't. Think about your own mourning. I mean, are you in any, you're lucky if you can get up and make the coffee, right? You're really in no shape to make lasting decisions. I think it's important to have representatives of different groups, but I think it should be up to professionals to have perhaps the final vote. I think with this also, there's no clear example of how the site defines the content. It's smack in the middle of American history on the National Mall between the Washington and Lincoln Memorials, a war that, many people try to push to the sidelines. It's also a very important reminder that initial controversies often evaporate into thin air. So don't be discouraged if you find yourself in the midst of one. Can I have the next one? I want to end with an invitation that I hope some of you will pick up on. The 15th annual, no, it's not annual, it's semi-annual. Public Art Dialogue is the journal of the organization with the same name that I founded together with Cher Krause Knight some time ago. We are co-editing a special issue focused on unbuilt memorials, and I'll tell you what I mean by that and where this idea came from. I was speaking with an artist friend of mine who showed me a proposal she'd made for a commission she didn't receive. She was in the finalists, but she didn't make the final round. And I thought, gee, this is a lot better than what they picked. How many things like that are out there that we know nothing about? There are all these ideas for memorials, and they're sitting on studio walls or archival files. So we are looking for works that you may have submitted to competitions that you didn't win, ideas that you've had floating around. We're also interested in contributions of ideas from public art curators, historians, etc. artists can submit artist projects with abstracts and explanations. Initially, you can send an abstract to me. I'll share it with Share. I always have trouble saying that. We can put my email up there in a second. And then Cher and I will review your initial abstract and give you suggestions. We'll say, this really isn't appropriate for this issue, which may be the case, or we find this really interesting, but please concentrate on this aspect, something like that. You know, we'll give you a little guidance. Complete, that's it. Then we're hands off until we get all the complete abstracts and articles with images must be submitted through the Public Art Dialogue PAD website. These are due June 1st. The issue will come out next March, will be the 15th anniversary of the journal. I can't believe it's been out there that long. So I hope you will send something in, and thank you for your attention. And does anybody have any questions?